The morning in downtown San Francisco came in cold and silver. The Mercer Meridian Tower rose 64 floors into a slate sky, its glass face washed pale by the early light. Inside the marble lobby, footsteps echoed across the polished floor as employees in tailored suits crossed toward elevators they had earned the right to use. Almost nothing in the building remembered why it had been built. A man in a charcoal coat stepped through the revolving door. He was 29 years old, tall, broad in the shoulders, and tired in a way that had less to do with sleep than with what he was carrying. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled. His leather shoes were worn down at the heels. In one hand he held a worn leather folder. In the other, the small hand of a 6-year-old girl in a pale blue cardigan. The girl was Matilda Mercer. Her hair was a little tousled from the early flight. She held the same stuffed rabbit her mother had once tucked under her arm in a hospital nursery. She looked up at the great silver letters on the wall and read the name slowly to herself. Then she tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, is this the company Mommy used to talk about?" Dante Mercer paused. Mercer Meridian. He had not stood in this lobby in 5 years. He nodded once and squeezed her hand. Behind the desk, Constance Whitaker looked up. She was 58, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears. The moment she saw him, her hands stilled on the keyboard. She knew him by the way he settled his hand on the small shoulder beside him. But Constance said nothing. She had worked long enough in this building to understand that some men only walked back through their own doors as strangers when they had a reason to. Dante said he had a scheduled interview for an entry-level operations analyst position. The name on the calendar was not his real name. Constance handed him a visitor badge and gestured to the waiting area. He thanked her and led Matilda over. They sat together on a long bench. At first Matilda watched the elevators rise and fall. As the minutes passed, her curiosity faded. People in tailored suits walked by without looking at them. A young assistant glanced at Dante's worn shoes and looked away. 10 minutes passed. 20. 40. An hour. No one offered them water. No one asked the child if she was hungry. Dante took a small package of crackers from his pocket and gave it to her. She ate carefully, but a few crumbs fell. A passing assistant frowned. "This is not a daycare," she said quietly, and walked on. Dante bent down without a word and gathered the crumbs into his palm. Beyond the glass wall, an executive meeting was already in progress. Callista Reed sat at the head of the table, 28 years old, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, a cream V-neck dress, a calm and distant expression. To her right, Oliver Blackwell, 48, polished, holding a fountain pen between 2 fingers as if it were a small and patient weapon. Across from him, Zane Caldwell, 45, leaned back with the easy contempt of a man who believed every room belonged to him. Zane glanced through the glass and saw the man on the bench and the little girl with the rabbit. His mouth curled. "Another desperate father," he said, just loud enough for the others to hear, "who thinks a button-down shirt is an executive credential." A few directors laughed. Matilda heard. She lowered her head and pressed the rabbit harder against her chest. Dante did not look up. But his fingers closed slowly on the leather folder, the way a man closes his hand on something he has decided not to drop. 10 years before, none of this glass had existed. There had only been a small rented warehouse outside Denver, a man in greasy work clothes, and a woman named Rosalind who refused to let him give up. Dante Mercer had not been born to comfort. He had grown up in a Colorado town where his father repaired engines and his mother worked nights as a nurse. He had earned his engineering degree on a scholarship and 3 jobs at once. What he had always believed was that technology only earned its name when it served the people no one bothered to count. His first design had been a clean energy storage system meant to keep the lights on in rural hospitals, in country schools, in towns that storms tended to forget. He had met Rosalind in the cafeteria of a small public hospital. She was not a businesswoman. She did not know how to raise capital. But she believed him. When his first investor turned him down and Dante came home ready to quit, Rosalind had looked across the kitchen table and said simply, "If what you are building can keep an emergency room lit, then it is worth continuing." When the rent on the warehouse came due, she had sold her car so they could pay it. Henry Lawson had been Dante's closest friend since college, a quiet, blunt engineer whose loyalty did not announce itself. The three of them had slept on the warehouse floor in those first months. They had eaten cold meals. They had rebuilt circuits at 3 a.m. They had survived on faith in something many serious men had told them was impossible. When the prototype finally worked, Mercer Meridian was born. The press called Dante a young genius. He always corrected them. The company had been built by Rosalind's belief, by Henry's stubborn intelligence, and by the sweat of those who had stayed when leaving would have been wiser. Then the bad year came. When Matilda was very small, Rosalind died of a complication that had nothing in it of mercy. A year later, Henry Lawson was killed in a testing accident at a remote lab. 2 losses in 12 months. Dante did not have the strength left to stand at the center of anything. He stepped back. He handed daily operations to Oliver Blackwell, to Zane Caldwell, to the leadership team Henry had once helped recruit. He kept his controlling stake. He kept a founder's emergency clause buried in the corporate charter. But he disappeared from public view. For 5 years, he lived the life of an ordinary father. He learned to braid his daughter's hair. He drove her to kindergarten. He read her stories before sleep. He fixed cars in the garage on Saturdays, and on Sunday nights he made simple dinners she could help stir. To the world, he was the missing billionaire who had walked away. To Matilda, he was simply the man who was always there when she woke from a bad dream. The night the email came, the house on the hill was very quiet. Matilda was already asleep, her rabbit tucked under her chin. Dante sat at the kitchen table, his coffee cooling beside him. On the screen he had opened an old video clip. Rosalind, in their first warehouse, her hair tied back, dust on her hands, laughing and saying that one day Mercer Meridian would keep the lights on in places the rich never thought about. A new message blinked at the corner of the screen. The sender was unnamed. The subject line was a single sentence. "They are selling what Rosalind died believing in." Dante stared at the words for a long time before he opened the message. Inside were 21 attached files. Closed session minutes, side contracts, budget transfers, internal correspondence. An almost finished sale agreement to a corporation called Blackridge Energy. He read until the sky outside began to turn pale. The picture that emerged was patient and cruel. Oliver Blackwell and Zane Caldwell had been preparing to sell Mercer Meridian to Blackridge Energy, a fossil fuel conglomerate that had circled the company for years. The price was more than 40% below true value. After the sale, Blackridge intended to shut down the Clean Energy Research Division, lay off hundreds of engineers, and keep the patents only to prevent rivals from using them. Every project Rosalind had cared about would die. The backup battery system for rural hospitals, the grid for underfunded schools, the disaster recovery program for storm-broken communities. None of these had been line items to her. They had been the reason the company existed. Oliver was scheduled to receive a personal payout of $95 million if the deal closed. Zane was promised a board seat at Blackridge. Worse, the directors had spent 18 months quietly cutting research budgets so that Mercer Meridian would look weak on paper, weak enough to justify a cheap sale. The sender was Archie Bennett, a mid-level financial analyst, 31 years old. Archie had noticed irregularities while reconciling vendor accounts. He had traced shell companies, missing approvals, repeated payment codes. He had not dared report it internally. He had not dared trust the board. The only person he had been able to think of was the founder. Dante did not call the press. Public noise would let Oliver erase the trail. He did not call the board either, because he did not yet know which members had been bought. He decided he had to walk into the building himself, as a stranger, and see what the company had become. In the morning, Matilda saw him take an old charcoal coat from the back of the closet. It was the coat he had worn to his first investor pitch. She asked him where he was going. Dante said he had business in San Francisco. She asked if she could come because school was closed. He was about to say no. Then she said, "Mommy said that company is part of our family too." The words struck a place in him he had been avoiding for 5 years. He brought her with him because she was the reason he could no longer let her mother's name be sold. Dante had registered for the interview under a false name and an entry-level title. He wanted to feel the company the way a person without standing felt it. A place that had remained decent would treat the least important visitor with the same dignity as the most important. When he and Matilda arrived at the lobby, he used none of his old privileges. He did not call ahead to a lawyer. He did not message Constance. He walked through the main door like everyone else. From the bench, while Matilda swung her feet quietly, Dante watched. An older custodian was asked to clean faster and step out of the way before an investor's tour passed through. A young assistant was scolded in the open lobby for printing a folder cover in the wrong shade of blue. An engineer in a lab coat was stopped by a security guard from boarding the executive elevator because the guard explained today there were guests of importance upstairs. Dante saw something in those small scenes that hurt him more than any spreadsheet could. The culture had moved from respecting people to worshiping image. The building no longer felt like the company he and Rosalind and Henry had built. Matilda leaned close. "Why is nobody smiling, Daddy?" He did not have a true answer. He said gently, "They are busy, sweetheart." But he knew it was not busyness. It was coldness pretending to be discipline. Inside the glass conference room, Oliver was presenting what he called a strategic restructuring. He used careful words. Asset optimization, shareholder protection, reduced research risk. Underneath each phrase was the same simple fact. He was selling the company to Blackridge. Callista Reed sat at the head of the table because the board had wanted a young, sharp face for the press. She believed she was steering the company through a delicate moment. She did not know that Oliver was showing her only summaries that had been carefully cleaned. She did not know that the dirty clauses lived in appendices she had never seen. When Callista glanced through the glass and saw the man on the bench with a child beside him, her brow tightened with the small displeasure of someone who believed this was unprofessional. Oliver caught her expression and used it. "That kind of personal sentiment," he said quietly, "was the weakness of the Dante Mercer era. Too many feelings. Too many family stories. This company has finally grown up." Callista said nothing. She had been told too often, by men older than her, that softness was a vulnerability she could not afford. So she had taught herself to be colder than the men around her, certain that this was the only road to authority. She did not yet see how that coldness had begun to make her blind. Almost an hour had passed. Matilda was tired and hungry. She tried to sit up straight. She tried not to be a bother. But when the laughter came again from behind the glass wall, she felt small in a way she had not felt before. She tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she said softly, "do they not like us?" The question struck Dante harder than any insult of his own ever had. He could endure mockery aimed at himself. But Matilda was not supposed to learn that her father deserved this kind of treatment. Just then, Zane Caldwell stepped out of the conference room with 2 other directors. He walked slowly past the bench and stopped in front of Dante. "You are the candidate for the analyst slot?" he asked. Dante looked up calmly. "I am." Zane glanced at Dante's worn shoes, then at Matilda. "Friendly advice," he said, loud enough for the lobby to hear. "If you want anyone to believe you have a future here, do not bring small children to a corporate office, and do not wear a suit that looks like it came out of a donation bin." A few people laughed. The laughter was not loud, but in a quiet lobby it traveled. Matilda's face turned hot. Her voice trembled. Daddy's suit is not ugly. A grown man somewhere should have been ashamed. Zane only laughed harder. At least the kid is loyal. Matilda's eyes filled with tears. She bent her head down so that the rabbit covered her mouth. Dante laid his hand on her shoulder. His silence changed. It was no longer the silence of observation. It was the silence of a decision being made. Callista stepped out of the conference room because the noise had begun to attract attention. She looked at Dante. She looked at Matilda. For a moment, something in her face flickered, as if the cold layer had been touched. But Oliver was standing behind her, watching how she would handle it, and she was a young woman who had spent every working day refusing to look uncertain. "Sir," she said evenly, "this is the executive floor. If you cannot maintain a professional environment, we will need to ask you to leave." Dante looked at her steadily. He did not raise his voice. "Is professional," he asked, "the word for letting a 6-year-old hear a grown man insult her father?" Callista hesitated. The question went straight into a place she had not let anyone touch in years. But instead of an answer, she chose composure, the kind that costs the most. Zane turned to a security officer. "Escort him out." 2 guards took a step forward. Matilda gasped and pressed her face against her father's coat. Dante crouched to her eye level. He wiped the tears from her cheek with the side of his thumb. "Stand with Miss Constance for a moment," he said softly. "Daddy is not going to let this place become your worst memory." The guards stepped closer. Dante did not resist. He simply looked once at Callista and asked her quietly, "Is the meeting to approve the sale of this company already underway?" Every voice in the lobby fell off at once. Callista's eyes sharpened. "Excuse me?" Dante did not answer. He took the visitor badge from around his neck and pressed it gently into Constance's palm. Then he looked at Matilda. Constance left her place behind the desk and walked around to the bench. She held out her hand to the little girl. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she said. "Your daddy knows what he is doing." Matilda was still afraid, but she nodded. Dante stood and walked toward the conference room. Zane gestured at the guards to stop him. Dante reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small black metal card. The card carried a charter authentication code, the kind issued only to founders and controlling shareholders. The lead guard saw the card and his face changed. He stepped back at once. Zane's voice rose. "What are you doing? Block him." No one moved. Dante pushed open the conference room door. The entire upper power structure of Mercer Meridian was inside. Oliver Blackwell, Zane Caldwell, Callista Reed, the General Counsel, 2 members of the Board of Directors, 3 senior officers, 2 representatives from Blackridge Energy. On the table, the final draft of the sale agreement was waiting for signatures. Zane followed him in, trying to recover the room. "You have no right to be in here." Dante did not look at him. He walked the length of the table to the seat at the head, the seat that had been left empty out of habit. He set his old leather folder down. The sound was small but absolute. Oliver Blackwell turned. His annoyance lasted only a few seconds. Then his face went white. He had seen this man before. He'd seen this jaw, this stillness, this pair of eyes. He recognized the founder he had once told the press had stepped away forever. Callista did not understand yet. She only saw a man she had ordered out of her lobby walking into her boardroom with a calm that was not hers to grant. Dante opened the folder. He took out the founder's card and laid it down beside Oliver's draft contract. The card was simple, black, engraved in clean white letters. Dante Mercer. Under Darmus Tomanove. Controlling shareholder. Charter authority holder. The general counsel rose so quickly that his pen rolled to the floor. Callista stared at the card and her face went pale. Zane's mouth opened and closed without words. Dante looked at no one in particular. His voice was even. "I sat outside that door for an hour," he said. "Long enough to understand that this company is not only being sold. It has been broken from the inside. The silence that followed was not a pause. It was the sound of a room realizing the ground beneath it had moved. What followed took 6 minutes. Later, those who had been in the room would describe it the way survivors describe a precise storm. There was no shouting. There was only the steady hand of a man who had decided the time for silence was finished. In the first minute, Dante presented identification. The general counsel ran the card against the company's authentication system. The system confirmed his status as founder, controlling shareholder, and charter authority holder. Oliver tried to push back. He said, with the smooth confidence he had perfected over 20 years, that Dante had been absent from operations for too long to interfere now. Dante did not raise his voice. I do not need a corner office to know when a company is being betrayed. In the second minute, Dante laid the Blackridge Energy sale agreement on the table. He turned the page that listed the transaction price. The number was 40% below the company's true valuation. One of the Blackridge representatives reached for the document. Dante set his hand on it. Do not touch it. The original is already at 3 different law firms. The room understood, in that moment, that he had not arrived to threaten. He had arrived prepared. In the third minute, Dante exposed Oliver. He produced the personal payout agreement of $95 million, then a second sheet showing wire transfers to a consulting shell whose principals shared addresses with members of Oliver's family. Oliver tried to laugh. He called it a post-merger advisory structure. Dante turned the page calmly. The next sheet was an email Oliver had written, in his own words, instructing a deputy that the company's valuation would need to be softened before the contract was signed. A senior director on the far side of the table stood up and began to walk toward the door. Dante did not look up. Sit down. Your name is on page 14. The director sat. In the fourth minute, Dante exposed Zane. He laid out the systematic budget cuts to research, the postponed community projects, the redirected funds that had landed at affiliated subcontractors. Zane lost his composure. He shouted that Dante had abandoned the company, that he had no right to judge anyone who had stayed. Dante looked at him for the first time directly. I left this company to raise my daughter after I buried her mother. You stayed to sell what her mother believed in. Do not confuse those two things. The room went very still. It was not only a rebuttal. It was a verdict. In the fifth minute, Dante set in front of Callista a contract appendix that bore an electronic version of her signature. She read it. The clause was not in any summary she had ever approved. Oliver had used her acting authority to legitimize provisions she had never seen, while keeping the side agreements out of her sight. Her hand began to tremble for the first time. She understood with a slow and final clarity that she had not been steering this ship. She had been the figurehead at its bow. In the sixth minute, Dante drew out the founder emergency reinstatement clause. The clause had been written into the company's charter on the night it had first been incorporated. It allowed the founder to retake operational authority immediately if the company was found to be the target of fraud, undervalued sale, or betrayal of its founding mission. He took out a silver pen that had belonged to Rosalind. He signed the reinstatement order in front of every witness in the room. Then he laid down a stack of termination notices. Oliver Blackwell, Lane Caldwell, and every director whose name appears in these appendices. Your operational authority ends now. Zane shouted that this was illegal. Oliver threatened lawsuits. Dante answered without ceremony. Sue? Discovery will let the country know what you have done. The security team entered the room. This time they did not approach Dante. They approached Oliver, Zane, and the other named directors. As Zane was led past the glass wall, he saw Matilda standing beside Constance. She had stopped crying. She watched him walk past with the steady look of a child who did not yet understand everything, but understood enough to know that something had shifted in the world. When the room emptied, the silence remained. No one applauded. No one dared speak first. The reversal had happened quickly, but the consequences would unfold for months. Callista did not weep. She did not plead. She did not rush to apologize. She was a proud woman, and pride does not break itself easily. But the cold layer that had held her face together for years had cracked, and through the crack a different expression was beginning to appear. She looked at the documents in front of her. Then she looked through the glass at the bench where Matilda still held the rabbit, where Constance still had a steady hand on the child's shoulder. Dante asked her evenly, "How much did you know?" Callista was quiet for several seconds. "Not enough, and that was my failure." Her answer did not erase the harm she had let happen. But it told Dante what kind of person she was. Callista was not Oliver. She had been used. That did not make her innocent. It also did not make her irredeemable. Dante slid a second folder across the table. Inside it were the records that proved how Oliver had managed her. Meeting calendars rearranged. Full contracts withheld. Edited summaries delivered to her desk. Some of her electronic signatures attached to appendices she had never read. If the deal had broken in public, Callista would have been the face the press destroyed first. A memory came to her then. Her father, decades earlier, standing outside a Pennsylvania factory with a paper box of his belongings, after nearly 30 years of service. She had been small then. She had told herself that day that she would grow up to be the kind of person who never let her family be discarded by anyone again. Yet here she had stood beside men who had treated a father in front of his child the way her father had once been treated. Callista stood. She turned to the general counsel and the remaining board members. "I am formally requesting that the Blackridge transaction be frozen immediately, that an independent investigation be opened, and that emergency operational authority be granted to Mr. Mercer until that review is complete." One of the directors objected. He warned that the stock would fall. Callista looked at him without flinching. "If our share price needs a lie to stay upright, then it has already collapsed." The line passed through the room without resistance. From that minute on, Callista was not the cold woman from the lobby. She was not yet forgiven, but she had begun to make herself worthy of being heard. The news leaked within 20 minutes. Someone in the conference room had typed quickly, and the financial press did not need to be coaxed. The reclusive founder had returned. He had walked into his own building unrecognized. He had cleared his executive floor in a single morning. The stock began to fall before the lunch hour. Investors panicked. Some employees believed Dante had saved the company. Others believed he had lost his mind after years of seclusion. Still others believed Blackridge would sue, and that Mercer Meridian would not survive the year. Oliver and Zane fought back fast. They hired counsel. They circulated quiet statements, suggesting that Dante had been gone too long to understand the modern market, that he had acted on emotion connected to the death of his wife. They even hinted that he had brought his small daughter into the lobby that morning to manufacture a sympathetic image. Dante had won the boardroom. He had not yet won the war. Firing the men who had betrayed the company did not automatically heal it. The shock had only begun. That evening, Dante did not go home. Matilda fell asleep on a long sofa in a side office, her rabbit tucked against her chest. Constance brought a soft blanket and laid it over the child without making a sound. Dante stood in the doorway and watched his daughter sleep. He asked himself if it had been wrong to bring her here. Then he remembered the look in her eyes when the laughter had come through the glass wall. He understood that if he had stayed silent today, she would have grown up remembering that her father had bowed his head to people who did not deserve to keep their seats. Callista stayed too. She took off her heels and pulled her blazer over her shoulders. She sat with Dante in a small conference room and worked through the documents page by page. The silence between them was tense, but it was honest. She was a person trying late to do the work she had skipped. What they discovered was worse than they had thought. The research division had been hollowed out. 5 lead engineers had drafted resignation letters. A backup power project for a rural hospital network was on the edge of cancellation for lack of funds. Several small suppliers had not been paid for months, while their invoices had been redirected to a fake consulting firm. Callista finally asked in a low voice, "Why did you not come back sooner?" Dante looked at his sleeping daughter through the glass. "Because there are seasons when a father only has the strength left to save one child, not a whole company too." Callista did not answer. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire and not as a founder. She saw him as a man who had survived the kind of losses that change what a person believes is possible. Late that night, Archie Bennett was called up to the 60th floor. He came in nervous, certain he was about to be fired for sending the anonymous email. Dante stood and shook his hand. "You did what an entire executive floor was too afraid to do. You told the truth." Archie did not know what to say. He simply pressed his lips together and nodded. The next morning, Dante called an all-company meeting. The broadcast went out to every office. San Francisco to Chauvi, Denver, Dallas, Boston, the international branches. Some employees thought the company was going under. Some feared mass layoffs. Some thought the founder would deliver a sharp speech and disappear back into the shadow he had lived in for 5 years. Dante walked onto the stage in the same charcoal coat he had worn the day before. He did not change into a finer suit to prove anything. He wanted the people who worked at Mercer Meridian to see him as he was. Matilda sat in the front row with Constance. Callista stood off to the side, ready to step forward if she was needed. Dante did not begin with numbers. He began with a story. He told them about a rented warehouse outside Denver. He told them about Rosalind selling her old car to keep the lights on. He told them about Henry Lawson sleeping under a workbench to watch a pressure test through the night. He told them why Mercer Meridian had been founded. Not to become the largest company in its sector. To keep the lights on in places that the rest of the world had a habit of forgetting. Then he did something not all founders do. He admitted his own fault. "I once thought that holding a controlling stake was enough to protect a company. I was wrong. A company is not protected by paperwork. It is protected by the people who, every day, choose to do the right thing." The line landed gently. He was not trying to be a hero. He was a man taking responsibility for his absence. He announced 3 decisions. The first was that the entire Black Ridge Energy transaction was canceled. The second was that an independent investigation would begin at once, and all evidence of fraud would be transferred to the appropriate authorities. The third was that the research budget would be fully restored, with priority given to the projects that had originally given the company its purpose. The hospital backup grids, the school energy programs, the disaster recovery initiatives in small communities that had quietly been written out of the plan. He spoke to the staff plainly. "If you wish to leave, you may leave with dignity. If you stay, you must understand that this company will no longer be run on fear, on contempt, or on agreements made behind closed doors." For a long moment, the room was still. Then Archie Bennett stood up. Then Constance stood. Then an older engineer in the third row. Then more, until almost the entire room was on its feet. Callista walked up to the stage. She stood beside Dante, but not in front of him. The polished hardness she had worn for years was gone. "I was wrong to believe that coldness was competence. I let a father be humiliated in front of his daughter inside this company. I will not hide that mistake. From this day, if I am still standing in this building, I will stand on the side of those who protect the truth." Matilda watched her. She did not understand everything an adult had just said. But she understood the simplest thing. A grown person had said sorry. 2 months passed. The investigation confirmed what the documents had suggested. Oliver Blackwell, Zane Caldwell, and the implicated directors were named in multiple civil and criminal proceedings. They lost their positions, their reputations, and their seats on every board they had previously held. Black Ridge Energy quietly withdrew its offer. Several members of the corporate board resigned. Mercer Meridian did not recover overnight. But the lights inside the research division came on again. Engineers who had been preparing to leave decided instead to stay. The hospital backup project moved forward. The small suppliers were paid. The fear that had lived in the building was thinning out. Dante did not consider the recovery of the share price his greatest victory. The moment that mattered to him came on an ordinary afternoon, when he passed the door of the research lab and overheard a young engineer say to a colleague, "This is starting to feel like the company I once applied to." Callista stayed at Mercer Meridian. She was no longer the acting chief executive. She had asked to take a different role, one in which she could rebuild what she had once allowed to be hollowed out. The relationship between her and Dante grew slowly. There was respect first. There was attention second. There was a careful warmth third. Neither of them was in a hurry. One quiet morning, he brought Matilda back to the main lobby. By then, employees had begun to recognize him. They stopped to greet him. But Dante did not bring his daughter to the lobby to celebrate his return to power. He led her to the same waiting bench where the two of them had once been kept for an hour like strangers. She looked up at him. "Daddy, why are we standing here?" He sat beside her, the same way he had sat that morning, with one knee bent and one arm around her shoulder. "Because this is the place I want you to remember. Not so you will hate anyone. So you will know something simple. When other people fail to see your worth, you must not forget it yourself." Constance watched them from her desk. She smiled. She had been there on the day the building first opened. She had seen the company lose its way. Now she had seen the founder come home. Callista approached. She wore a deep blue dress, simple and elegant, her hair softly tied. She lowered herself to the level of the bench so that her face was even with Matilda's. "I did not protect you the last time you were here. I am sorry." Matilda looked at her for a long second. Then she lifted her stuffed rabbit and let it touch the back of Callista's hand. It was not a grand forgiveness. It was the way a small child says that a wound has begun to close. The three of them stood. They walked together to the elevator. The doors slid open. Dante stepped inside with his daughter's hand in his and Callista beside him, and the panel above the door began to rise toward the executive floor. But this time, he was no longer a father kept waiting in his own office. He was no longer a man returning to take revenge. He walked back into Mercer Meridian as a man who had remembered at last what real power was meant to do. It was meant to protect those who could not protect themselves.